Pro bono publico, a Latin phrase meaning for the public good, is most often associated with free legal services lawyers provide to people who need help but cannot afford to pay for it. As a Boston lawyer, I'm proud of the commitment so many lawyers, law firms, and others have made to providing pro bono legal services to people and organizations in need. No Boston lawyer better reflects that commitment than Sue Finegan, a partner and chair of the Pro Bono Committee of the Mintz law firm, a firm with a long and laudable tradition of pro bono service. In this episode of Higher Callings, I asked Sue about the pro bono work she and other Mintz lawyers perform. We also discussed a number of topics about pro bono legal services, including why lawyers and other legal professionals choose to engage in pro bono work, how law firms incentivize their lawyers to take on pro bono cases, how working on pro bono cases provides important training for new lawyers, what Massachusetts has done to provide pro bono opportunities for retired lawyers, and how in-house corporate lawyers and government lawyers work with law firms to staff pro bono cases. I began the interview by asking Sue about a truly extraordinary scene I witnessed during a formal Boston Bar Foundation event on a cold Saturday night during the earliest days of the Trump presidency, when she and other pro bono lawyers were suddenly called into action to address an emerging crisis. I'm Don Frederico, and this is Higher Callings. Sue Finegan, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for joining me today. When I think about pro bono lawyers in Boston, you're always the first person to come to mind.
Oh, well, thank you. It's nice to be speaking with you this morning.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about it. And you and your firm have quite a tradition of pro bono. And just to introduce you briefly, you're at Mintz, a well-known law firm in Boston, and you are a full-time pro bono lawyer there, chairing the pro bono work that Mintz and many of its attorneys do. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. I wanted to start out just kind of setting the scene with what was really an extraordinary event that I got to witness a glimpse of in 2017. And so let me set the stage, and then I'll turn it over to you to talk about what happened at the point where I leave off. So this was at the Boston Bar Foundation holds an annual gala called the Adams Benefit, named after John and Abigail Adams, because this is Boston after all. And at the gala, this is the charitable arm of the Boston Bar Association. So it raises a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars every year at this one event, which then is part of the money that the foundation distributes to various legal services organizations throughout the Boston area that really come to depend in part on the funds that are raised. So it's a black tie event. Men are there in their tuxedos, women are there in their gowns. There is a VIP event as part of it at the very beginning. In a room upstairs, there's a gallery with paintings by really famous historical artists. It's really a wonderful place within the Museum of Fine Arts. I think I left that out. The event is held at the Museum of Fine Arts. It's usually on the coldest day of the winter, on a Saturday night, and it takes place. It used to take place every year at the end of January, like the last weekend of January. So, in 2017, as usual, my wife and I attended the event, including that VIP event where there's recognition of a leader in the legal community in pro bono or other charitable legal work. And, there were probably up to 100 lawyers and their partners in that room, as is true all the time. And people are milling around, they're enjoying themselves, they're having cocktails, they're having hors d'oeuvres, and again, people are dressed to the nines. And all of a sudden, at this event in that particular year, I saw a group of lawyers suddenly huddling kind of off to the side and in a very agitated state, like something was happening that had a great deal of urgency. You, I believe, I'm quite sure, were one of those lawyers. And then after a lot of animated conversation among that small group, a number of you suddenly left the event. I didn't know where you were going at first. I think I asked somebody, what's happening? Where are you going? And what I learned was that our new president, number 45, had just issued an immediate travel ban for people trying to immigrate from certain countries into the United States. And you all left to go immediately to Logan Airport, where people were coming in from other countries and were being detained because of this travel ban. With no notice, it was just a very sudden thing. Really an extraordinary thing, and of course a disruption for those of you who went. But that's all I knew until I learned more about it later. Tell us what happened that night.
Yeah, it was really an extraordinary evening. Throughout the day, actually, just to back up a bit, I had been getting phone calls from immigration advocates, in particular Susan Church, who was the president of the immigration bar in New England. And she had highlighted that most likely there would be something happening at the airport that night that would necessitate people going into court. And, at the time, I didn't really believe her. It's not something that you think about on a Saturday while you're getting ready to go to an event or you're going on about your business. And she had called several people at the same time. And so I continued on. I didn't really think that anything like that would happen on a Saturday evening. Sure enough, she called, I think it was about 8 o'clock at night. She called and said, you have to get over to the airport immediately. That planes are starting to arrive from overseas. And there are two people in particular who are impacted by this Muslim travel ban. And the two people that were impacted were actually professors at University of Massachusetts. And they were impacted and they were detained. And so she said, you have to immediately come over to the airport. So we basically went over with a group of 3 people and we dropped everything. And as you said, it was freezing out. I don't know why we thought to not bring our coats, but we thought it was so urgent that we couldn't even wait in line to get our coats or get our car, and just jumped in an Uber over to the airport. So
you showed up in the airport again in your formal clothing.
Exactly. And everyone's kind of looking at us, but there were a lot of people protesting. It was kind of an incredible event. And while I was there, because it was so chaotic, we decided to go to the court, and they opened the court for us, the federal court for us that night. And it was probably, by that point, it was about 9:30 or 10.
How do you make that happen? I know there's usually an emergency judge assigned all the time.
Yeah. I think that, honestly, Susan Church actually made some phone calls, and they opened up the court, and there were 2 emergency judges that came in, one a magistrate judge, another federal district court judge, and they decided to sit en banc, and kind of, since it was such an extraordinary situation, Judge Barrow said 2 heads are better than 1, and so we'll both sit en banc and figure out what to do. And so Matt Siegel from ACLU came in from his house, and he had a template that was being used across the country by the ACLU in these lawsuits. And sure enough, there was an argument that was held, and we were all doing research on our phones. And by 2:45 in the morning, we got the order that we had hoped to get.
Who was there arguing on the other side for the government?
Well, there was actually the immigration, AUSA was there, but unfortunately, or I guess interestingly, when former President Trump enacted this, he hadn't really spoken to DOJ, and he hadn't really given them the heads up that this was going to go out. And so I think across the country, much like in Boston, none of the AUSAs knew what to do. Like, they had no guidance from DOJ how to respond. And so he really did. It was a really tricky time because he didn't know what to say, because he was kind of surprised as well.
Yeah.
So we were able to get, actually, that night, the broadest interpretation of the injunction of anywhere else in the country. And so throughout the next week, where all of these cases were playing out, many people who were stranded in other parts of the world were coming in through Logan to try to get access to the country.
What happened to the two professors?
They ended up getting out of detention, so it was kind of tricky. So we were trying to get in there before, so it would still be a relevant case, And so we ended up filing the case in short order, and they ended up getting out of detention, thankfully. But we kind of argued to the judge that this is an act that could be repeated, and subject to the same kind of treatment. And so that resonated with the judges, and they were able to give us this pretty broad injunction, at least for the week that it was pending.
Right.
So it was an extraordinary time, and it just kind of showed, I think, the power of the law, and in kind of an unusual way too, like on a Saturday evening, to be able to file something against the President of the United States, and having people come together from all walks of life.
Yeah.
People were at different events. Some people were at the Adams Ball. Some people were at birthday parties. Some people were just spending time at home. Some people were hiking, and everyone showed up at the court in different stages of dress, should I say. No one appropriate for court, really, but
Right.
But that's
Well,
okay.
appropriate for court on a cold Saturday night, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The judges were, because they were wearing their robes, of course. So,
Yeah.
But other than that,
Now, remind me, what happened to the travel ban after that?
well, so what happened was we had a hearing in court in front of a different judge. It was reassigned. And we didn't prevail on that secondary hearing, at least in Massachusetts. But it ended up getting litigated throughout the United States. And then President Trump kept changing it because the original one that was drafted was just so overly broad and discriminatory. And it was pretty easy to find that it was in violation of the Constitution. Eventually, it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. But that was a different draft of the travel ban by that point. So,
Okay.
But it was an exciting and sleep deprived week while it was pending in court that week.
Yeah, I'll always remember that. Just the little glimpse of it I got at the very beginning at the Adams benefit. It was, it's hopefully something that will never happen again during one of those events.
Yeah. In fact, I ended up, when I came home that evening, of course I hadn't eaten anything, because we were going to the event and we had to immediately leave. And as I was having my dinner at 3:00 in the morning, I thought to myself, "Oh my gosh, I just sued the president and prevailed, and what's going to happen?" That's kind of a crazy situation.
Well, and you really put into effect what the Boston Bar Foundation stands for too.
Absolutely.
I mean, here you were providing
yeah.
free legal services to people who needed something immediately done for on an issue of civil rights. It was really
that's exactly right.
remarkable.
It was a really crazy and a remarkable time, and I was just glad to get the phone call, and be able to serve and go to the court that night.
So what I'd like to do now is kind of back up. I mean, that was one extraordinary event I thought it'd be good to focus on at the outset, but let's back up a little bit and just learn a little bit about you and why you became a lawyer and how you got involved in pro bono work, which is really your full-time job and has been for a number of years. Why did you decide you wanted to be a lawyer?
That's a good question, because when I was growing up, I didn't really know any lawyers at all. I had no lawyers in my family, and didn't really grow up in a town that had many lawyers in it. But my dad was really was a public servant, worked for the government as an engineer for his whole career. And both he and my mom were really committed to the community in terms of volunteering. My dad mostly with environmental issues, and my mom did a lot of work with tutoring to folks in the community. So while I didn't have any exposure to lawyers per se, I saw them as examples of giving back and the importance of giving back. And I also just loved to read and to write. And so when I went to Dartmouth as an undergrad, I was a government major and was really focused on trying to do as much, pre-law as I could. I eventually, ended up, after a couple of years working after college, I went back to law school.
Right. And you went to Boston College Law School.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right.
Had a bit of a Jesuit education, I suppose, which I don't know if that had any
Absolutely.
influence on you in terms of your
Yeah.
thinking about what you wanted to do as a lawyer.
It did actually. I specifically went to BC because of that, I think, and then when you go there, you basically are, kind of, it's instilled in you that, you are, it's important to give back, and, we are really privileged to be lawyers, and that's part of what we do, is to give back to the community and to give back to people who need the help. And so I had every intention of going into either the public sector or public interest when I graduated, and was able to clerk for a couple of years. But I was thinking also above my law school debt, and so I tried to find a law firm where I would feel comfortable, and where I could, kind of have a nice mix of both, doing pro bono, but also getting good experience doing commercial litigation.
So you ended up at Mintz. Mintz, it used to be Mintz, Levin, Cohen, and Popio or something, I think.
Yes, it was
I'm
very
sure
long.
Glovsky's
very
in there
long
somewhere.
Name. Yes,
Yeah.
there's a bunch of names, exactly. Now we
But-
go by Mintz, but
Okay, and it's been around for a long time, and it's a very well known and well respected Boston-based law firm. I know there are other offices outside of Boston, but I'll always think of it as a Boston law firm. And it had a track record for pro bono at the time you joined it, didn't it?
it did actually, and it actually goes back to the founding of the law firm back in the Depression. There were, several Jewish lawyers actually who, felt ostracized by the white shoe kind of Christian larger firms, and decided to form their own firm. And all of them were really dedicated to giving back. And so when I joined the firm many years later, they had a pretty vibrant, robust pro bono program, a lot in the area of immigration and domestic violence. And so definitely resonated with me about when I went to choose which law firm I wanted to join. It definitely, having a robust pro bono program was a really important piece of the decision.
Yeah, my memory is there's the Boston Bar Association has an award called the Haskell Cohn Award, who I believe was one of the named partners at Mintz. And I remember I've attended that event several times. It's an award that's usually given, I think usually around June, to a judge who reflects a real spirit of public service. I remember maybe the first time I went, I think, is it possible that Mr. Mintz was there? Was he still alive at the time?
Yes, he loved that event, actually.
Yeah.
He loved that event. He was very close with Haskell Cohn. I missed out on being practicing with Haskell Cohn by a couple of months, but he was a Dartmouth alum, and Mr. Mintz loved that event. So he just really loved it. And when he, a couple of years before he passed away, he said, listen, if I end up passing away, which I will, I want you to make sure that this continues, because this is a really important part of our history as a firm.
Yeah, it really is. And I know the Boston Bar Association has always appreciated Mintz's support in that regard, and for that very special award and award ceremony as well. Okay, so you went to Mintz. What kind of work did you do when you got there?
So when I got there, I was doing mostly commercial litigation, just a very general practice, something that you probably can't do now, just general commercial litigation, which I really loved, because I don't know, you just learned about something new every day, and I really loved it. And I was able to do a lot of pro bono work. I probably did about 200 hours of pro bono work every year.
That is a lot.
Yeah, on like homelessness and on gender violence and immigration primarily during those years. But I was there for about 10 years with that kind of mix, both as an associate and a partner.
And then you became the pro bono partner at Mintz. Tell me about that. Was that a new position that was created?
Yeah, so I ended up leaving the firm after 10 years to be the legal director at a nonprofit called the Victim Rights Law Center, focused on sexual assault clients. And so I was there for about 3 years, but I kept in touch with people from Mintz, because Mintz did a lot of pro bono work. And I got a call from a couple of people at the firm saying that they were thinking about trying to do a better job at managing their pro bono program. There's like 300 or 400 cases going on at any given time.
That's
and hundreds
a ton.
of people working on them. So if you think about it, it's like a pretty big section of the firm.
How big was the firm at the time, Susan?
I'm trying to think. When I came back to the firm in 2007, I think we had like 4 different offices throughout the country, and probably 350, 400 lawyers, something like that.
And 300 of them were doing pro bono?
Well, it was staff too, like 300,
Oh, okay.
like 300 staff and project analysts and paralegals. And so I think they wanted to like make it not just a like our Pro Bono Committee did a great job, at managing it, but they kind of wanted someone to really manage it instead. So they invited me to come back as a partner, and I became the full-time pro bono partner in the litigation section. And I was oversaw the pro bono work of the firm in all the offices, and became the chair of the Pro Bono Committee too.
And you actually also have litigated some of the pro bono cases as well.
That's right. Yeah. Part of it was that when I came back, it was actually really interesting. They said, we really want you to focus on pro bono cases, and we want you to mentor junior associates in the litigation section and give them really good professional development opportunities. So typically I have between 5 and 15 cases that I work on at any given time. And those cases can range from like having one associate work with me to like, a really large team of like 10 people or 15 people working on a case.
Are there still hundreds of people at Mintz every year that are doing something along the pro bono lines?
Yeah. It's funny, like, we have about 300 or 400 matters going on, and I know just give an example of, we had put out a call for volunteers about a year ago to help with Afghanistan refugees, and I was thinking that we probably wouldn't get that many people. It's the summer, everyone's on vacation, people are really busy. And just for that one project alone, within 24 hours, we had 110 people at the firm raise their hand to help.
Wow.
Which was actually not just attorneys, it was like people in the marketing department. And so about 10% of the entire staff firm-wide volunteered to help on these cases. So
let's talk about that a little bit. I think, I'm interested in how different law firms handle pro bono. I don't think I know of other firms that have a lawyer serving as the full-time pro bono lawyer and chair of the pro bono practice, though maybe there are, maybe other firms do that. What's your understanding or experience with that?
I would say I came in 2007 into this role, and at the time it was relatively new. I would say that most of the top 200 firms have someone kind of managing, sometimes not a lawyer, sometimes not a practicing lawyer. I would say that people who are in the pro bono partner level role, there's probably a couple of dozen of us globally, like, in other countries too. So there aren't that many people who are playing that same role, but there are a lot of people who are doing something, in pro bono.
Sure.
Making sure the firm is managed. Yeah.
My experience, which is very limited because it's basically the few law firms I've worked for, there are pro bono partners, but they're also expected to practice law that is generating revenue for the firm.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
You're not in that role. You're 100% of your time is pro bono. One issue that comes up frequently with pro bono programs is, how do you incentivize lawyers to take on pro bono cases? Typically, historically at least, law firms measured compensation based on a lawyer's productivity, and the primary focus of that has always been on how much revenue are you generating for the firm. But I know most law firms, certainly I think probably all the large law firms, take pro bono into account in some way and give people credit for that in determining their compensation. How does it work at Mintz? And how do you get 100 lawyers to raise their hand when one matter comes in the door?
Yeah, that's really, it's interesting. Sometimes I'm really shocked myself when people are raising their hands, but I think that if you are finding really good and interesting projects, and you are making sure that people are well supervised, and you're working with a legal services partner that's going to help mentor people feel much more comfortable about raising their hands. And that Afghanistan example is a good one of people reading the front page of the newspaper and reaching out and saying, like, listen, I really want to get involved in the Afghanistan crisis. What can we do? And I think that particular incentive has come about over the last maybe 4 or 5 years. It's kind of like one crisis after another, and so trying to respond to every single thing that comes through the front page of the newspaper is a little challenging.
Yeah.
The most recent, I guess, would be the reproductive rights issue. And that's something that, we've been trying to find some good opportunities for people. In terms of incentivizing people too, like we are definitely, a lot of firms have like caps on their pro bono time or have mandatory pro bono. We don't have either of those. So, and I can see the benefit of doing both. Like some people want to have a mandatory pro bono number so that they can, to the outside world, they can say 100% of their people participated. And then others have caps for that very reason you mentioned, because they have to incentivize. So ours is, we can do unlimited, but you have to reach a certain threshold in order for it all to count for your bonus purposes.
Okay.
But there are several people I know right now who have 300 hours of pro bono time, and they'll get a bonus based on all of those hours, because they're quite busy.
Well, and it sounds like, sure, there's a financial incentive up to a point in doing pro bono. And you don't want to have, if you don't have that, then what you really have is a disincentive from doing pro bono because it takes time away from the work you do get paid for. But
Right.
It sounds like there's also just a lot of internal motivation, that people respond to a need that they want to be part of the solution for.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, having done hiring at the firm, I think a lot of people gravitate towards the firm. I know I did, because of the mission of doing pro bono and being able to do kind of any project you want to do. Like you could come up with a good, as long as it meets the standards, being able to do that. And so, I think that's also an incentive, to get people in the door who really care about and I really try to work hard on getting people to work, to do pro bono work right away when they start at the firm. Because I feel like if you start right away while you're a law student, you'll continue on throughout your career.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also provides good training, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. A good example of that is I had a restraining order case in district court in August, and I asked a second-year associate to come with me, and he did all of the cross-examination for the witnesses at this hearing,
great.
which was an amazing experience.
Yeah.
I didn't realize till after that he had never done it before, so it was a little. He was very confident and did a great job, and then we prevailed. But then the defendant appealed, and then I reached out to like a sixth year who really wanted to get some appellate experience. And so now I'm supervising her on that project. It's the same project,
great?
Same client, but I know that she really wanted to get some appellate experience.
It's really a win-win for the law firms and for everybody else. I mean, it's you're doing something that's really good and necessary and important. And at the same time, you're helping to develop new lawyers. And I know there's a lot of effort, in some courts at least, to emphasize the importance of getting experience for younger lawyers, because they don't get into court the way at least my generation did when we were very young. We were trying cases in our first, second, third year. That doesn't happen anymore unless you get a pro bono case that's suitable. You also have to make sure you're not throwing a first-year associate into the most important pro bono case of the firm. But it's a great way for people to get training.
No, it definitely is. And, I was thinking of, that reminded me of a case I had been working on with several associates at the firm with the ACLU. And when it came time to argue the opposition to the motion to dismiss, we had our 6-year associate argue on behalf of Mintz. We had several partners on the case. But he did all the work, and he wouldn't have gotten that opportunity probably in one of his commercial cases, and so he did an amazing job. So I think you're not necessarily, given the way things are right now with clients and client demands and other constraints, it's really hard to get that court experience, and so that's using pro bono for that is really helpful too.
Okay. Was that the Brito case you were just talking about?
Actually, it's not. That is a case that I'm working on with the ACLU on because the government has not done anything with the humanitarian parole cases that I mentioned from Afghanistan. The government has really either delayed or denied the adjudication of those, and so we filed a case last August with the ACLU. That was the first case to try to force the government to move along those cases more quickly, because many of our clients we've had several clients, unfortunately, who have perished, have been murdered by the Taliban while their cases are pending. And so it's a real urgent case. So
how does working with an organization like the ACLU work? How does the partnering between a private law firm and an organization like that work?
It really depends. Like, I think it kind of, over time, you get to know the different organizations. And I would say the ACLU is an amazing organization to work with, because they're true co-counsel in the matter. And so, and over time, like, we've worked on several cases with them, there's just a level of respect, and, we kind of know how to divvy up the matters. With newer co-counsels, it's a little bit you kind of have to figure it out, as you go along. Some people want to get, it depends on like who's going to have the final say. With the ACLU, it's much more collaborative, but you kind of have to work that all out through a co-counsel agreement beforehand, so that you don't end up getting in a situation where you're, in conflict later on.
One case you did handle with the ACLU was the Brito case. And I thank you for sending me the citation to the decision. I read the decision, and it also went up to the First Circuit. You won it. You and your colleagues and the ACLU won it at both levels. Tell us a little bit about that case. I think it was a very important case, and tell us what it was about.
It was a really important case, because what we had found was that detainees who are detained by ICE in immigration contexts had a very difficult time getting out of detention, and many of them, almost all of them, had no counsel and no access to counsel. And so what happened was, if you're in detention and you're basically are kind of untethered from a lawyer or untethered from your community too, you are put before an immigration court and go through a bond hearing with the court, and you kind of have to handle it on your own. And so previously, before this case, the detainee, who was unrepresented, was required to bear the burden of proof as to not being a flight risk or a danger to the community in order to be released. And so we argued in our case that the flip should be, the burden of proof should shift to the government, much like it is in the criminal context, when the government should have to prove that.
This was, so just to set it up again, a little more context, this is all based on a statute, but the statute was silent on who has the burden of proof.
Yes,
right?
yes. And it was really interesting, because what we found was that this whole thing went sideways in a case about 22 years ago or so. And since then, immigration courts were just relying on this case that went sideways and had this strange burden of proof. And so we were trying to right-size it and have it kind of make sense, honestly. Have the government prove that the detainee was a flight risk or a danger to the community in front of an immigration court. So it really was kind of extraordinary, because we were in front of Judge Saras, and after the ruling, it had an immediate impact in the Boston Immigration Court. In fact, I think the ruling came down on a Friday, and then on Monday, the immigration court had a training for everyone in the court system, and everything flipped on Monday. And we also were able to rally about 100 pro bono lawyers to represent all the detainees throughout New England, to try to go and make an argument that they too should be released from detention.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't imagine what it was like for the detainee. How long would somebody potentially be in detention, waiting for this bond hearing, or even after the bond hearing?
Well, the plaintiffs in the case, like, someone was in detention for like 6 months, having not done anything, and some of them had the strike against them, perhaps, was that they had a notice to appear in immigration court, but the notice to appear said to show up on a Saturday night, or something like that, like very like due process considerations. And so that was really troubling for us and for Judge Saras, and then the First Circuit too. So, and I think we'll see what happens. But
I think you had 3 named plaintiffs, and when you read their stories, I mean, you obviously found 3 really great named plaintiffs, because this was a class action, And they were the class representatives. But when you read their stories, how could anyone possibly imagine that they were flight risk? They were in the country for years. They were working. They had families,
right.
good
Yes.
citizens. Well, not good non-citizens, I guess. But
Yeah, right.
just extraordinary that anybody would assume they could be a flight risk, and then try to imagine how does somebody, especially somebody that doesn't have counsel, but how does anybody prove the negative?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it was really the stories and the families that we got to know. It was just an extraordinary situation, and we were lucky that Judge Saris ruled the way that she did, and then the First Circuit upheld the burden shifting, which was terrific as well. So we'll see what happens with that
Is
case.
that issue in the Supreme Court?
It's
you
not
said
in
we'll
the
see what
Supreme
happens.
Court.
Okay.
We're kind of like waiting to see what the government does. There's been some circuits that have ruled different ways, so we'll just see what happens. Hopefully it won't go up to the Supreme Court.
You mentioned work that you and others are doing in women's reproductive rights, and I assume that's work that really got started after the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. Can you talk a little bit about the work there?
Yeah, so that actually, it's been interesting. I would say our health lawyers have been the most involved in this work because a lot of the issues do arise in the health space. Our litigators have done some research, but the health lawyers are doing a lot of work with different national organizations. And so we're really pleased to be able to partner with some organizations like Lawyers for Good Government and Planned Parenthood and the Center for Reproductive Rights. And we've also joined several alliances, like there's an alliance out in California that we've been aligned with to try to get cases and help. And then in Massachusetts recently, the AG's office just initiated a hotline that anyone who wants to ask questions about reproductive rights in Massachusetts could access. And there were 5 law firms that signed up to help, and we're one of those law firms.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. You have to be nimble, don't you? I think that story of what happened at the Adams benefit shows a certain degree of nimbleness, but also you get the Dobbs decision. You knew it was coming before it actually came down, but still
we
you
did,
had
but
to
it's
act
interesting
quickly.
too. Yeah, and you want to make sure, I think the hard part is you want to manage expectations because I think everyone wants to help, but you also want to make sure you get opportunities that are substantive and you're working with good organizations too, which is not always the case. Not every organization is going to be a good partner. So yeah, you do have to be nimble, and there's a little bit of crisis fatigue going on too in the pro bono community. Those that run our programs,
Yeah, I
like
bet.
every day there's something new, and during the prior administration, there was something new every week that you were trying to respond to. So, but it's exciting too. You can make a difference. So that's really what it's all about.
Well, and you and your firm and many other pro bono lawyers in Boston and elsewhere really do make a difference. Well, you're also engaged with different committees and commissions. One of them is the Access to Justice Commission. How did you get involved in that, and what does it do?
So I got involved in the Access to Justice Commission through my work on the SJC's Pro Bono Committee. And I was really trying to work on that committee, on the Pro Bono Committee, and trying to help the Access to Justice Commission kind of focus on pro bono as a way of addressing the access to justice crisis. And the commission itself generally really focuses on the premise that the court system has developed over the last, centuries, right? And it was developed by lawyers and judges, and it was developed with the thought in mind that a judge would be sitting on the bench, and there would be a plaintiff and a defendant, both of whom have lawyers. But the reality over the last 40 years or so, right, is that in many courts in Massachusetts and elsewhere, the family court, housing court, consumer debt, a majority, and sometimes even up to like 99% of the people don't have any lawyer. And so the court, it's a very difficult situation for a judge to oversee that kind of proceeding because no one knows what they're doing. And some of the things they're dealing with are so complex. When you're dealing with an eviction and you're dealing with like eviction law in Massachusetts, it's really difficult. And so a lot of what we focused on as a commission was really looking at what are the barriers to entry in the court system and what could we do to address those.
Yeah. So how did you do that?
Well, I'll give you one example. So since I mentioned I was focusing on pro bono, about, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 years ago, I was sitting in my office and my colleague Martha Koster, who is a retired partner, and she was about to retire, came to see me, and she said, Sue, I really want to retire, but I want to continue practicing law, but I want to do pro bono work, full time, and I want to really give back to the community. And she said, I think others may want to do that too. And so I said to her, well, that's great. Let's see if we can start a program and see if we can get some senior lawyers and judges engaged. And so we spent about a year really kind of testing that theory and looking at different programs throughout the country and trying to figure out a way to make it work. And so we piloted a program a year later, Martha being one of the pilot attorneys.
Yeah.
And since then, close to maybe 200 lawyers and judges have given back 10 to 20 hours a week of time doing pro bono work at different organizations.
Yeah, I saw that. That's it looks like a excellent program. How has it worked out? I mean, is a lot of good work being done?
Yeah, it's really amazing, actually. We started this program and had kind of low expectations because we were told by many people that it really wouldn't work, and people may get, they wouldn't get excited about the work. But we found was that people generally who gravitated towards it have loved it. And Martha, for example, has continued. She has done immigration work for PAIR, the Political Asylum Immigration Representation Project, and she's continued doing that for 10 years. And she works like 20 or 30 hours a week doing those cases. So it's pretty amazing. And she's not unusual. Most people do continue with either their partner agency or work on another issue. And they've really made a huge difference in working in legal aid organizations, working in the court system, working for nonprofits, and a lot of them using the skills that they were using as a commercial litigator or a real estate lawyer or a nonprofit lawyer, and really dedicating their time to that. But secondarily, which is not something that I had really anticipated, we've tried to develop this community of lawyers. And I think when you retire, you're kind of looking continue to have a community. And this has provided a community for a lot of retired and retiring lawyers and judges to continue to work and share their experiences. And we meet once a month and share experiences and learn about issues relating to access to justice and low-income people throughout Massachusetts and nationally.
It's such a great idea and such a great opportunity for people who do want to keep helping, using their law degree and their experience to help people after they retire. So kudos to you and the others for doing that. You also were on an SJC committee. I'm forgetting exactly the name of the committee that you were on.
So I was it was the Standing Committee on Pro Bono Legal Services for many years, and that committee it really focuses on incentivizing lawyers to do pro bono work in the community, and so looking at things like the Adams Award and other Adams, the Adams Award that they give out every year for extraordinary pro bono work, and also thinking about one thing we thought about was how to expand on the awards that were given out. And so one thing we did was give out awards to law students as well to incentivize them. And their stories are really incredible. They each give speeches at the Adams Award ceremony, and the law student typically is just extraordinary and will continue to do that for throughout their lives, I think.
That's great. Now, one thing we haven't touched on, and we probably should mention it, even though you and I are both litigators, we always think of pro bono work as litigation, but there's a lot of non-litigation pro bono work out there. Can you give us some examples of some of the things that you've seen at Mintz or elsewhere?
Yeah. So, there's some more of the kind of traditional, transactional work. So people working on behalf of nonprofits and serving as outside general counsel, or working on mergers of two nonprofits. And then there's also, over the last decades, there's been an uptick in, particularly at the Lawyers for Civil Rights or Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights across the country, working with low-income entrepreneurs and kind of working with low-income entrepreneurs who are working on like companies. You're helping people start for-profit companies, but you're also helping them because they're in areas of the community that need help, and they're working on issues that maybe they're socially minded, or maybe they're just trying to start a company and they need the help. And then also we've had a lot of success in using our transactional lawyers on some of the kind of either lobbying or research projects. And I'll mention two. So like one is, we've done a lot of work in Massachusetts on gender violence and working on trying to change laws with respect to restraining order provisions or human trafficking provisions. And then in terms of our research, we're working on a project for an international nonprofit on trying to find the best laws around the world for addressing domestic violence. And they're advocates in Thailand, and so they're trying to propose, changes to Thailand's laws that would relate to gender violence. And that's not something that a litigator necessarily needs to do. So we have a project that involves some litigators, but a lot of transactional lawyers too. And it's a great way for people to get involved on really interesting projects that could really make a difference systemically too.
One thing I'm curious about, and I assume you have your finger on the pulse of this, if there's any pulse left in it, about, 12 or 13 years ago, and I'm sure before and after that to some extent, there was a movement to try to develop a right to counsel in civil cases. They call it the civil Gideon. I know Gideon versus Wainwright was the Supreme Court case that established that there was a right to counsel in criminal cases for people who could not afford their own lawyer. And so there was a movement that was actually seemed to be gaining some momentum back around 2010, 2011. The ABA was part of that movement. They had lawyers, I think David Boies and Ted Olson were chairing it, if I recall, pretty well-known lawyers. And they were going around the country having hearings to try to develop a record to establish why there should be a right to counsel in civil cases. Nothing global, I guess, ever came out of that. Maybe there were some projects that developed. I know that around the same time, it might have been before or after, the Massachusetts courts developed a program for the housing court for people to have a lawyer for a day when they were having their eviction hearing. So somebody could come in, help them for one day, and then when the case was over, they no longer would have an attorney-client relationship if they had one at all, and they would hopefully be very helpful to those people who were seeking to prevent their evictions. So what happened? Is there still any life left in the movement to have a civil right to counsel, or has that ship sailed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So as you know, the BBA had a committee that focused on this issue in 2007, I think, or 2008, I think. And the focus areas were on immigration and housing and family court, and came up with some pilot programs. And I think it was tricky because at the time funding wasn't available to do that. But they did serve as a basis for later on. And so, for example, in the housing context, the people that worked on that pilot are people that continued working on that, Jean Terrell, Russell Engler, and others. And then during the COVID crisis, there was a right to counsel, actually, for several years, funded by Governor Baker. And, that pilot sort of served as the pilot concept served as a basis for that. So it's really interesting. So you're right, there isn't this global framework. But I will say that people are still very much working on this project. And I would say that there are different ways to get at the issue. One would be through litigation. So I worked on a case that went up to the SJC with legal aid, and we were successful at getting a right to counsel in a guardianship case. So that's one way, through case law. And then another way is through like funding through the through the government, either the governor or the legislature. That's another way. And I think there are just different template models throughout the country. So, for example, in New York, there is a right to counsel for housing and also a right to counsel in immigration proceedings, too. So it's kind of interesting. So the little pilot's going on, but you're right. It hasn't really taken off in terms of the way one had hoped to. A lot of that does relate to funding and not necessarily relate to the need, because the need is so great. So it's really, I think it's tricky, but it's still going on, but it hasn't made the big national splash that one would hope that it would.
Yeah, it seemed to sort of fizzle out, but fortunately there's still a lot of good people doing pro bono work to meet at least some of that need.
Right, right.
And programs like the Housing Court Lawyer for the Day program.
And that's still going strong, too. That's still going strong.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of other things I want to cover with you just briefly. I looked at your bio, and you've won like 24 or more recognitions and awards for the work you've done, which is truly extraordinary. In 2020, you won the Ralph D. Gantz Award for Extraordinary Leadership in Pro Bono Services. You were the inaugural recipient of that award, which, as I understand it, is given out by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And for those who don't know, Ralph Gantz was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court for a number of years. He died suddenly and unexpectedly a few years ago and was a real loss to the legal community and the court system. You worked really closely with him for a number of years, I think, on access to justice and pro bono, the Pro Bono Committee. Can you just say a few words about his legacy, Chief Justice Ralph Gantz's legacy?
Yeah, sure. I was really fortunate to work with him and so many others. Like, it's a pretty amazing a community of access to justice champions in Massachusetts. We're really lucky to be in Massachusetts with so many people. And I guess the biggest legacy is that, the work of the commission is still going strong under the leadership now of Justice Georges and now Mary Jane Benner Brown, both of them co-chairing it. And so I think that's the biggest legacy, I would say, because people are continuing to work on these issues, these really important issues of access. And it would have been really a shame for everything to just come to a halt. But luckily, there's a whole community of people who really care about these issues. And I rotated off two of the commission a year and a half ago. But it's still going strong, and I'm really proud of the fact that it's still going really strong.
What do you see as the need right now for any kind of systemic advancement of access to justice in the court system? And that could be an hour-long conversation.
Exactly.
I'm going to give you a couple minutes.
Okay.
But what are some of the needs?
I'll try to be brief.
Sure.
I mean, I think you touched upon one, is getting attorney access, whether it be a full-time legal aid attorney or a pro bono attorney, getting a right to an access to a lawyer in some context, whether it's a lawyer for a day program or full representation, is critical. I think recognizing that not everyone can have a lawyer, I would say that making the courts user-friendly for self-represented litigants is really is imperative, and that includes simplifying forms. It sounds kind of very simple, but the fact that in some courts you could go to one court in one area and have one form, and then go to another court and have another form for doing the very same thing. Simplifying the forms could really, I think, catapult access to justice, because you could have someone who's not even a lawyer help someone fill out a simplified form.
Sure.
And so that's another aspect. I think the other things to mention are language access as well is really critical. If you don't understand the language, no matter how simple the form is, you're not going to be able to really understand what's going on. And so making sure that that people can actually understand what's happening by having language access is really critical too.
Another thing we haven't touched on is that pro bono work is not limited to private practice lawyers. I know that a number of corporations have their legal departments very interested. There are lawyers in their legal departments who are very interested in doing pro bono work, and you've spoken with some of them, I think. What do you see happening within corporate legal departments?
That's actually a real interesting trend over the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years, is the real interest in in-house counsel in trying to do pro bono work. Many of them came from firms that had a structure in place. And so it's a little bit daunting, I think, sometimes for in-house counsel to actually set up a bespoke program for all of their attorneys.
Sure.
So a lot of them are relying on their law firms. And so we just did a program last week with a client of ours, and it was a mix of Mintz lawyers and this client's lawyers, and trying to make it easy for them to kind of plug in and be trained and at least give them the structure that's missing, I think, is really important. And so I think the more we can simplify things and provide kind of bite-sized opportunities for in-house counsel, the better off we'll be. And I would also give a shout out in DC, for example, a lot of government lawyers are doing pro bono work too. So it's really interesting to think about starting out as a law student, what you can do, and then whatever you decide, whatever you go into, whether it's private practice or the government or in-house counsel, trying to plug in some ways, and then providing for opportunities when you're retired too. So it's sort of a whole spectrum of opportunity, I think.
One thing I came to realize several years ago was that you can't always count on somebody just to hand you a pro bono case. You could say, I want to do pro bono. Oh, here's a case. Sometimes you actually have to take the initiative and go either find the case or connect to the organization that has the need, and they'll find a case for you, or they'll have a case ready for you. For the attorney or law student, I suppose, but mostly attorneys who listen to this podcast, what advice do you have about how they can get involved in pro bono?
Yeah, I would say start with your bar association or your law school, because law schools now have people who are in charge of pro bono opportunities, which is most of them do.
Yeah.
And then bar associations are a terrific way to get plugged in. I mean, both the Boston Bar and the Mass Bar have amazing opportunities for people to, at least, even if they're not, the bar association isn't doing the project, they can at least send you to the right place and find a resource. And then I would just say it would be really important to network with people like me to find out what are the good opportunities in your community, because they are not all equal. Some of them are better than others at doing pro bono work, and you want to have a good experience, and you want to get the right training and mentorship too, because the worst thing you could do is take on something that you don't know what you're doing and have a bad experience. And obviously your client is not going to benefit from that either. So I would try those three things, and I would just encourage everyone to try to give back. I mean, we have this amazing profession, in that not all professions have it, of giving back to the community, and where it's a real privilege to be a lawyer. And there are just many things that you can do to really save someone's life, or help them get out of poverty, or address their civil rights violations. And we can all do that because we have been trained to do that. So.
And I can tell you, as someone who's a little more advanced in my career than you are, that when I look back now on the career that I've had, the things I remember most and am most proud of are the pro bono cases I did. And I didn't do a ton of them, but I did some. And those are the cases that stand out, that I am really grateful I had the opportunity to work on more than any others. So
yeah, I agree. Those are the cases that they're just incredible opportunities, but also the ones that keep you up at night too, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of they're relying on you to really solve some really difficult problems for them. So, but it's all for the good.
It is all for the good. Sue, thank you very much. This has been a really, I've enjoyed this conversation. I admire, as you can tell, the work you and your colleagues at Mintz do. I think, I know the firm must be very proud of it. And I'm just really grateful that there are lawyers like you and law firms like Mintz that are out there meeting the need that so desperately exists in so many quarters. So thank you. You're a great role model.
Oh, thank you, Don. Nice to speak with you.
It's good to speak with you. Take care.
This has been an episode of Higher Callings. Your host is Donald Federico. Music is provided by Fancy Mountain, and our logo was designed by Matt Pedro. The associate producer is Brian Federico. Higher Callings is a production of Federico Media, LLC.